I still hear that whistle in my dreams. The 4:15 westbound, cutting through the December air like a blade through cloth. 10 years have passed since that day, but the sound haunts me still, sharp and lonesome as a coyote's cry. Mother stood on that platform in her blue wool coat, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold. She clutched her traveling bag with one hand, and with the other, she adjusted that red scarf around her neck. The Millbrook station wasn't much to look at even then. A weathered wooden platform, a small depot building with peeling paint, and 2 sets of tracks that stretched east toward Denver and west toward the mountains. In winter, it felt like the loneliest place on God's green earth. The wind would sweep down from the peaks, carrying snow and the promise of storms. Mother had been waiting there for nearly an hour, checking her pocket watch every few minutes. I was 16 then, old enough to work the ranch, but still young enough to believe my mother would always come home. She'd been planning this trip for months, ever since the letter arrived from her sister in California. Aunt Helen was sick, Mother said, and needed family close. The ranch could spare her for a few weeks, especially with winter setting in and most of the cattle moved to lower pastures. Father had driven her to the station in our old buckboard, the wheels crunching through the frost-hardened mud. I remember how small she looked standing there, dwarfed by the vast Montana sky. The mountains loomed behind her like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in grey clouds. She waved to us as we pulled away, her red scarf bright against the colourless landscape. That was the last time anyone saw Margaret Hawthorne alive. The train pulled in right on schedule, black smoke billowing from its stack. The conductor helped her aboard, tipping his hat politely. 3 other passengers got on that day, but they all got off at their destinations. When the train reached the end of the line in Sacramento, Mother's seat was empty. Her traveling bag was gone, but nobody could say when she'd left the train or where she'd gone. The railroad company investigated, of course. They questioned the conductor, the engineer, even the other passengers. Everyone remembered seeing her board, but nobody could recall seeing her leave. It was as if she'd simply vanished into the winter air. The sheriff organized search parties, but what could they find? The train had covered 300 miles of wilderness, crossing rivers and valleys, climbing through mountain passes where a person could disappear forever. Father aged 10 years in the weeks that followed. He barely spoke, barely ate, just sat by the window watching the road as if Mother might come walking up any moment. The ranch hands were good to us, taking on extra work without being asked. They all loved Mother, you see. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, of turning our rough frontier home into something warm and safe. Winter deepened, and still no word came. The snows fell heavy that year, blocking the passes and isolating us from the outside world. I learned to read the weather like Father taught me, watching the sky for signs of storms. The wind would howl through the eaves at night, and I'd lie awake thinking about Mother somewhere out there in the cold and dark. Spring brought no answers, only more questions. A few reported sightings came in from towns along the rail line, but they all proved false. Someone thought they'd seen her in a hotel in Butte. Another claimed she'd been spotted boarding a stagecoach in Missoula. Each lead turned to dust, leaving us with nothing but hope and heartache. The years passed slowly after that. Father and I kept the ranch running, but it was never the same. The house felt empty without Mother's laughter, without her humming while she worked in the kitchen. I grew into manhood carrying that weight. That unanswered question that followed me everywhere. What happened to Margaret Hawthorne on that winter day? Where did she go when she stepped off that train? I married eventually, had children of my own, but I never stopped wondering. On quiet evenings, I'd find myself staring out at the mountains, thinking about that red scarf and the woman who wore it. The railway station was torn down years ago, replaced by a newer depot closer to town. But in my mind, it's still there, frozen in time like a photograph. The wind still blows cold through these mountains, carrying memories and regrets. Sometimes I think I can hear that train whistle echoing across the years, calling out to the lost and the lonely. Mother always said the mountains kept their secrets well. I just never thought one of those secrets would be her. The first year without Mother was the hardest. Every morning I'd wake expecting to smell her coffee brewing, to hear her moving around the kitchen as she prepared breakfast for the hands. Instead, there was only silence and the empty chair at the head of the table. Father tried to fill the void, but he was lost without her. She'd been the heart of our home, the one who kept us all connected and grounded. I took over many of Mother's duties around the ranch, cooking for the hands, managing the household accounts, corresponding with buyers and suppliers. It was woman's work, the older hands grumbled, but they ate my biscuits and didn't complain too loudly. I wasn't half the cook Mother had been, but I learned. We all learned to make do with less, to find comfort in smaller things. The railroad company closed the case after 6 months. No evidence of foul play, they said. Mrs. Hawthorne likely chose to leave the train at one of the smaller stops, but I knew better. Mother wouldn't have abandoned us without word. She'd promised to write every week, to let us know she'd arrived safely. Those letters never came because she never had the chance to write them. Father hired a private detective that spring, a man named Morrison who claimed to specialize in missing persons. He came to the ranch with impressive credentials and confident promises, but after 3 months of investigation, he had nothing to show for his efforts. The trail had gone cold, he said. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses had scattered to the wind. I began my own searches then, riding the rail line during roundup breaks and winter lulls. I'd stop at every station, every water stop, every section house along the way. I showed Mother's photograph to station masters and section hands, to hotel clerks and general store owners. A few remembered her face, that bright smile and those kind eyes, but none had seen her after she boarded the train that December day. The mountains held their secrets close. I rode through valleys where the snow never fully melted, where the wind carved strange shapes in the rock. I followed game trails that led nowhere, crossed streams that ran cold and clear from hidden springs. The landscape was beautiful but unforgiving, a place where a person could vanish without a trace. Father's health began to fail in the 3rd year. The doctor said it was his heart, but I knew better. He was dying of grief, of questions that had no answers. He'd sit for hours on the front porch, staring out at the road that led to the railway station. Sometimes I'd catch him talking to himself, carrying on conversations with Mother as if she were still there beside him. I married Sarah Mackenzie in the 4th year, more for companionship than love. She was a good woman, patient and understanding, but she could never fill the space Mother had left behind. We had 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl. I named the girl Margaret after Mother, hoping somehow to keep her memory alive in our family. The ranch prospered despite our losses. The cattle multiplied, the land produced good grass, and the market for beef remained strong. But success felt hollow without Mother there to share it. She'd always been the one to celebrate our victories, to remind us that we were blessed. Without her, the achievements felt meaningless, just numbers in a ledger book. Father died on a winter morning in the 7th year, quietly in his sleep. His last words were Mother's name, whispered so softly I almost missed them. We buried him in the family plot behind the house, next to the empty grave we'd prepared for Mother. The headstone read, "Beloved wife and mother," though we had no body to lay beneath it. I became the sole owner of the ranch then, responsible for everything Mother and Father had built together. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on me like a mountain. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the wind and wondering if I was strong enough to carry on their legacy. Sarah would find me sometimes, standing at the window in the darkness, searching the horizon for something that would never come. The children grew up hearing stories about their grandmother, about the woman who disappeared on a winter day. They'd ask questions I couldn't answer, wonder why she'd never come home. I told them she'd loved them, even though she'd never met them, that somewhere out there she was watching over us all. It was a comfort, even if I didn't entirely believe it myself. The railway station was abandoned in the 8th year, replaced by a more modern facility closer to the growing town. I watched them tear down the old platform, the depot building where Mother had waited for her train. It felt like they were erasing the last physical connection to that terrible day. But memories don't need buildings to survive. They live in the heart, in the spaces between heartbeats. The mystery consumed me slowly, like a cancer eating away at my peace. I'd find myself taking long rides through the mountains, following old trails and forgotten paths. I was searching for something, though I couldn't say what. A sign, perhaps, a clue that everyone else had missed. Some small piece of evidence that would finally tell me what happened to Margaret Hawthorne. 9 years passed, like pages in a book, each one marking another year without answers. The children grew taller, Sarah's hair began to show grey, and I found myself becoming more like father every day, quiet, watchful, always listening for the sound of footsteps on the front porch that would never come. The mountains kept their secrets, and I kept my vigil, waiting for the day when truth would finally emerge from the shadows. The 10th winter came early that year, bringing heavy snows that blocked the mountain passes by November. I was checking the fence line in the high pasture when I saw the search party coming down from Whitman's Peak. They moved slowly through the deep snow, their horses struggling against the drifts. At first, I thought they were hunters or maybe surveyors, but as they got closer, I could see they were carrying something. Sheriff Coleman was leading the group, his face grim beneath his ice-crusted mustache. Behind him rode Doc Patterson and 2 men I didn't recognize, probably from the county. They'd wrapped their burden in a canvas tarp, but I could see the shape of it across the lead horse's back. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't say why. Something about their manner, their careful movements, told me this was more than just a hunting accident. They'd found the body of a prospector named Jenkins, the sheriff explained, frozen solid in a snow cave about 2 miles up the mountain. The man had been missing since September, and his family had been worried sick. They'd finally organized a search party when the weather cleared enough to make the climb. What they found was Jenkins' body and something else. Something that made the sheriff's hands shake as he reached into his saddlebag. It was a scarf. Red wool, faded now, but still recognizable. The same scarf Mother had worn on that December day 10 years ago. The sheriff held it carefully, as if it might crumble at his touch. The fabric was stiff with age and cold, but it was definitely hers. I'd seen her wear it 100 times, had watched her knit it herself during the long winter evenings. Found it wrapped around a tree branch about 50 yards from the body, Sheriff Coleman said. His voice was gentle, but I could hear the weight of implications behind his words. Been there a long time, by the looks of it. The snow preserved it pretty well, but the colors faded some. He handed it to me, and I felt the coarse wool against my fingers, cold as the mountain air. My hands trembled as I examined the scarf. There was no mistaking it for anything else. Mother had embroidered her initials in one corner, tiny letters in darker red thread, M.H. for Margaret Hawthorne. The stitches were still visible, though faded like everything else. I pressed the fabric to my face, hoping to catch some trace of her scent, but there was only the smell of snow and pine needles. The location where they'd found it made no sense. Whitman's Peak was miles from the railway line, accessible only by horse or on foot. The terrain was rough, full of loose rock and hidden crevices. No woman in her right mind would have attempted that climb alone, especially not in winter. Yet here was proof that Mother had been there, had somehow made it to one of the most remote places in the county. Sheriff Coleman suggested we organize a proper search of the area, but I knew it would be useless. 10 years of snow and wind had scoured those mountains clean. If there had been any other trace of Mother, it would be long gone by now. The scarf was a miracle, preserved by chance and the peculiar conditions of that high altitude. We wouldn't find anything else. I rode up to the site myself the next day, following the tracks the search party had left in the snow. The climb was treacherous, the path barely visible beneath the drifts. My horse struggled with the altitude, breathing hard in the thin air. I had to dismount and lead him for the last half-mile, my boots crunching through the crust into the soft snow beneath. The tree where they'd found the scarf was a twisted pine, gnarled by years of mountain weather. I could see where the fabric had been caught, wrapped around a low branch like a flag of surrender. The wind had probably torn it from Mother's neck, I thought. Or maybe she'd tied it there herself as some kind of marker. But a marker for what? I stood there in the bitter cold, holding the scarf and trying to imagine how Mother had ended up in that desolate place. The railway line was visible far below, a thin, dark line cutting through the valley. Had she somehow left the train and climbed up here? But why? What could have driven her to make such a dangerous journey in the middle of winter? The prospector's body had been found in a shallow cave, partially protected from the elements. Jenkins had been an experienced mountain man, someone who knew these peaks like his own backyard. If he'd died up here, what chance would Mother have had? The thought made my chest tight with old grief and new fear. I searched the area thoroughly, moving in expanding circles around the pine tree. The snow was deep and undisturbed, but I looked anyway, hoping to find some other clue. A piece of clothing, maybe, or one of her belongings. But there was nothing. Just the scarf, frozen in time like a question mark against the sky. The ride back down was harder than the climb up. My horse sensed my mood and moved carefully, as if he understood the weight of what we'd discovered. The scarf was wrapped around my wrist, its red wool stark against my brown coat. I could feel its presence like a physical ache, a reminder of all the years I'd spent wondering and waiting. That night, I sat by the fire with the scarf spread across my lap. Sarah watched me from her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly in the lamplight. The children were asleep upstairs, safe in their beds, unaware that their grandmother's ghost had finally stirred from its mountain grave. I stared into the flames and tried to piece together the fragments of a story that made no sense. The scarf changed everything. It was proof that Mother had been in those mountains, but it raised more questions than it answered. I spread out every map I could find, tracing possible routes from the railway line to Whitman's Peak. None of them made sense for a woman traveling alone in winter. The terrain was too rough, the weather too dangerous. Yet somehow, she'd made that journey. I began visiting the older residents of the county, people who might remember something from 10 years ago. Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's widow, recalled seeing a woman matching Mother's description at the general store in Millbrook, but that was the day before she disappeared. Old Pete Henley, who'd worked as a section hand on the railroad, thought he remembered her asking about the mountain trails, but his memory was fuzzy from years of drinking. Sarah grew concerned about my renewed obsession with Mother's disappearance. She'd find me awake at night, staring at the scarf or poring over maps by lamplight. "Let her rest," she'd say. "She's been gone 10 years, Thomas. You can't bring her back by torturing yourself." But I couldn't let it go. The scarf was like a key that had unlocked all the old questions. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail I could remember about Mother's last days. Her conversation had been strange that final week, I realized. She'd asked odd questions about the mountains, about the old mining claims and abandoned camps. At the time, I'd thought she was just making conversation, but now I wondered if there'd been something more. The letter from Aunt Helen had arrived in October. I remembered. Mother had been excited about the trip, about seeing her sister after so many years apart. But she'd also been secretive, spending long hours writing letters she never showed to anyone. I'd assumed she was corresponding with Helen, making plans for her visit. Now I wondered who else she might have been writing to. I found some of her personal effects in the attic, things Father had packed away after she disappeared, her writing desk, her jewelry box, a stack of books she'd been reading. At the bottom of the box was a bundle of letters, tied with a blue ribbon. Most were from Aunt Helen, filled with family news and gossip, but 3 were from someone else, someone who signed their name only as E.M. The letters were cryptic, written in a careful hand that I didn't recognize. They spoke of mutual interests and matters of importance that needed to be discussed in person. One mentioned a meeting place where the pine grows tall and the wind speaks truth. Another referenced the old claims that father worked before the war. These weren't family letters or social correspondence. They were business, though what kind of business I couldn't say. I showed the letters to Sheriff Coleman, but he was skeptical. "Could be anything," he said. "Your mother was a smart woman, probably had investments or property dealings you didn't know about. Lots of folks had secrets in those days." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was thinking the same thing I was thinking, that these letters might be connected to Mother's disappearance. I decided to investigate the mining claims mentioned in the letters. The county records showed dozens of abandoned sites throughout the mountains. Most of them played out before the war. But one name kept appearing in the documents: Elias Morrison, the same E.M. who'd written to Mother. He'd owned claims all through the high country, including several near Whitman's Peak. Morrison had been a prominent figure in the early days of the territory, arriving with the first wave of prospectors in the 1860s. He'd made and lost several fortunes, always chasing the next big strike. The records showed he'd died in 1889, just a year before Mother disappeared. But his estate had been tied up in litigation for years, with various parties claiming ownership of his properties. I hired a lawyer to research Morrison's holdings, particularly the claims near where Mother's scarf had been found. What we discovered was a complex web of partnerships, debts, and disputed ownership. Morrison had borrowed heavily against his properties, using them as collateral for various business ventures. When he died, the creditors had fought over the assets like vultures over a carcass. One document stood out from the rest: a partnership agreement between Morrison and someone named Margaret Hawthorne, dated just 6 months before Mother's disappearance. She'd invested $500 in one of his mining ventures, a substantial sum for our family at the time. But I'd never heard her mention any business dealings, and Father had been equally ignorant of her investments. The partnership was for a claim called the Lucky Strike, located high on Whitman's Peak. According to the agreement, Mother was entitled to half the profits from any ore extracted from the mine, but the claim had been abandoned years earlier, Morrison's death effectively ending any mining operations. So why had Mother been interested in a worthless hole in the ground? I found the answer in Morrison's personal papers, held by the lawyer who'd handled his estate. Among the documents was a geological survey of the Lucky Strike claim, conducted just before Morrison's death. The survey suggested the presence of a rich vein of silver ore, deeper than the original miners had dug. Morrison had been planning to reopen the mine when he died, leaving his partner to decide whether to continue the work. The pieces were starting to come together. Mother had been corresponding with Morrison about the mining claim, planning to visit the site and assess its potential. When he died, she'd inherited his share of the partnership, making her the sole owner of what might be a valuable property. But she'd needed to examine the claim herself before making any decisions about its future. That explained why she'd been asking about the mountain trails, why she'd been secretive about her correspondence. She'd been planning to visit the Lucky Strike mine, either on her way to California or after her return, but something had gone wrong. She'd made the dangerous journey up the mountain, but she'd never made it back down. The scarf was all that remained of Margaret Hawthorne's final adventure. I spent the next week studying the geological survey and old mining maps, trying to trace the route Mother would have taken to reach the Lucky Strike claim. The mine was located on the north face of Whitman's Peak, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through some of the most treacherous terrain in the county. Even experienced miners had found it challenging, and several had died in accidents over the years. The trail began at Miller's Crossing, a small settlement about 10 miles from the railway line. In Mother's time, it had been a supply depot for the mountain mines, with a general store, a boarding house, and a stable for rental horses. Now it was abandoned, just a few weathered buildings slowly falling apart. But in 1889, it would have been the logical starting point for anyone heading to the Lucky Strike. I rode to Miller's Crossing on a cold February morning, the mountains sharp and clear against the blue sky. The abandoned buildings stood like tombstones in the snow, their windows dark and empty. The general store still had its sign, the paint faded but readable, Miller's Trading Post, supplies for mining and prospecting. Behind it, the old stable was partially collapsed, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. I searched through the ruins, looking for any record of transactions from 10 years ago. Most of the paperwork had been destroyed by weather and time, but I found a few ledger books mouldering in what had been the store's office. The pages were water-stained and brittle, but some entries were still legible. I worked through them carefully, scanning for any mention of Margaret Hawthorne or supplies purchased in December 1889. There it was, near the bottom of a page dated December 15th, 1889. M. Hawthorne, 1 horse, 1 pack saddle, supplies for 3 days, paid in advance. The entry was written in a neat clerk's hand, with a note in the margin, headed for Lucky Strike. Advised against winter travel, Mother had been here, had rented a horse and supplies for the journey up the mountain. The date was significant. According to the railroad schedule, Mother's train had departed on December 14th. She must have left the train at one of the smaller stops, probably Millbrook or Cedar Falls, and made her way to Miller's Crossing. But why hadn't she told anyone about her plans? Why the secrecy, the deception about going to California? I found more evidence in the ruins of the boarding house. The guest register had survived, protected by a metal strongbox that had rusted shut over the years. Inside were the names of everyone who'd stayed there, including Mrs. M. Hawthorne, registered December 15th, 1889. She'd paid for 1 night, the clerk had noted, and asked for directions to the Lucky Strike mine. The trail to the mine was still visible, though barely. Years of snow and rock slides had obliterated most of it, leaving only occasional markers carved into the trees. I followed it as far as I could on horseback, then continued on foot when the path became too dangerous. The climb was brutal, the thin air burning my lungs with each breath. About halfway to the mine, I found the remains of a small camp. Someone had built a shelter against a boulder, using pine boughs and canvas to create a windbreak. The canvas was rotted now, hanging in tatters from the branches. But among the debris, I found something that made my heart skip. A tin cup with the initials M.H. scratched into the bottom. Mother had made it this far, at least. She'd camped here for the night, probably planning to reach the mine the next day. But something had gone wrong. Maybe the weather had turned, or maybe she'd encountered some other difficulty. The cup was the only trace of her presence, a small piece of metal that had survived a decade of mountain weather. I pressed on toward the mine, following the faint trail through increasingly difficult terrain. The path wound around massive boulders and across narrow ledges, always climbing toward the peak. In several places, the trail had been washed out by spring runoff, leaving gaps that would have been impossible to cross safely. How had Mother managed this journey in winter, when the conditions would have been even more treacherous? The Lucky Strike mine was a disappointment when I finally reached it. Just a hole in the mountainside, perhaps 20 feet deep, with a pile of tailings spilling down the slope. The entrance was partially collapsed, blocked by fallen rocks and debris. A few pieces of rusted equipment lay scattered around the site. A broken pickaxe, some bent metal pans, a wheelbarrow with a cracked wheel. I spent an hour searching the area around the mine, looking for any sign that Mother had been there. The ground was rocky and unforgiving, offering few clues. But near the entrance, Sheltered by an overhanging rock, I found something that made my blood run cold. A piece of blue wool cloth, caught on a sharp edge of stone. It was from Mother's coat, the same blue wool she'd been wearing when she left for the train station. The fabric was faded and weathered, but there was no mistaking it. She'd made it to the mine, had stood in this very spot, looking into the dark tunnel. But what had she found there, and why had she never made it home? I examined the mine entrance more carefully, moving rocks and debris to get a better look inside. The tunnel was deeper than I'd first thought, extending back into the mountain farther than my lantern could penetrate. The walls showed signs of recent work, tool marks that looked too fresh to be from the original mining operation. Someone had been working this claim recently within the last few years. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Mother hadn't been the only one interested in the Lucky Strike mine. Someone else had been here, had reopened the tunnel and begun extracting ore. The question was whether they'd been working when Mother arrived, and what had happened when she'd discovered their operation. I climbed back down the mountain as darkness fell, my mind racing with new possibilities. The scarf, the cup, the piece of blue cloth, they were all evidence that Mother had made the journey to the mine. But they were also evidence that she'd encountered something unexpected there, something that had prevented her from returning home. The mystery was deepening, and I was beginning to suspect that Mother's disappearance hadn't been an accident after all. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind churning with questions about what I'd discovered at the mine. The fresh tool marks, the evidence of recent work. It suggested that someone had been operating the Lucky Strike claim illegally, without proper ownership or permits. Mother had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to see, and it had cost her everything. The next morning, I returned to the lawyer's office to examine Morrison's papers more carefully. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. The Lucky Strike claim had been leased to a third party just months before Morrison's death, a man named Wade Garrett, who'd agreed to pay Morrison a percentage of any ore extracted. But Garrett had never filed the proper paperwork with the county, keeping the arrangement secret from the authorities. Garrett was a known criminal, the lawyer explained. He'd been involved in claim jumping, illegal mining operations, and worse. The territorial authorities had been looking for him for years, but he'd always managed to stay one step ahead of the law. If Mother had encountered him at the mine, she would have been in serious danger. I asked Sheriff Coleman about Garrett, but he was reluctant to speculate. "That's a serious accusation, Thomas," he said. "Garrett was a bad man, but that doesn't mean he killed your mother. Could be she just had an accident up there, got lost in the snow or fell into a ravine. Those mountains are dangerous, especially in winter." But I knew better. The evidence was too convenient, too carefully arranged. Mother's scarf found far from the mine, her other belongings never recovered. If she'd died in an accident, we would have found her body years ago. Someone had made sure she disappeared completely, and I was beginning to understand why. I hired a detective, a man named Harrison, who specialized in tracking down missing persons and fugitives. He was expensive, but he had a reputation for getting results. I gave him all the information I'd gathered about Garrett and the Lucky Strike claim, and asked him to find out what had happened to Mother on that mountain. Harrison's investigation took 3 months, but the results were worth the wait. He'd tracked down 2 of Garrett's former associates, men who'd worked with him on various illegal mining operations. Both were in prison now, serving time for other crimes, but they were willing to talk in exchange for consideration from the authorities. The story they told was chilling. Garrett had been working the Lucky Strike claim secretly for over a year, extracting high-grade silver ore and selling it through a network of corrupt dealers. He'd made a fortune from the operation, but he'd known it couldn't last. When Morrison died and the claim went into legal limbo, Garrett had seen his chance to make one final big score before disappearing. Mother's arrival at the mine had been a disaster for Garrett's plans. She'd been the legal owner of the claim, with documents proving her partnership with Morrison. If she'd reported the illegal mining operation to the authorities, Garrett would have faced serious charges. He couldn't afford to let her leave the mountain alive. The associates described Garrett as a violent man, someone who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect his interests. They'd heard him boast about eliminating problems before, people who'd gotten too close to his operations. When Mother had shown up at the mine, she'd become just another problem to be solved. According to their testimony, Garrett had killed Mother at the mine site, then disposed of her body somewhere in the mountains. He'd made it look like an accident, scattering her belongings to confuse any investigation. The scarf had been torn from her neck during the struggle, carried away by the wind to be found years later by chance. Harrison had tried to track down Garrett himself, but the man had vanished completely after 1889. Some said he'd fled to Mexico, others claimed he'd died in a mining accident in Colorado. The trail was cold, the witnesses unreliable, but the story they told felt true. It explained everything. Mother's secrecy, her dangerous journey to the mine, her complete disappearance. I felt a mixture of relief and rage as I absorbed this information. Relief because I finally had answers, finally understood what had happened to Mother. Rage because the man responsible had escaped justice, had probably lived out his days in comfort while we suffered with uncertainty and grief. But there was one more piece of the puzzle to uncover. If Garrett had killed Mother at the mine, where was her body? The mountains were vast, full of hidden valleys and deep ravines where a body could lie undiscovered for decades. But I needed to know. Needed to find some trace of her remains so I could finally lay her to rest. Harrison suggested we organize a proper search of the area around the Lucky Strike mine. With modern equipment and trained searchers, we might be able to find what the original investigations had missed. It would be expensive and difficult, but it was the only way to bring closure to Mother's story. I agreed to fund the search, using money from the ranch's profits. Sarah objected, worried about the cost and the emotional toll it would take on our family. But I couldn't let it go, couldn't rest until I knew where Mother's body lay. She deserved a proper burial, deserved to be brought home after all these years in the wilderness. The search was scheduled for late spring, when the snow would be melted and the mountain passes clear. I spent the remaining winter months preparing, gathering supplies and coordinating with the search team. The red scarf lay in my desk drawer, a reminder of the woman we'd lost and the justice we'd never found. But at least now I knew the truth, knew that Margaret Hawthorne had died trying to protect what was rightfully hers. Spring came late that year, the snow lingering well into May. I waited impatiently for the mountains to clear, checking the weather reports and consulting with the search team leader. Captain Morrison, no relation to the dead prospector, was a former military man who specialized in recovery operations. He assembled a team of experienced mountaineers and brought modern equipment, ropes, metal detectors, even a trained search dog. The search began on a bright June morning, the mountain air crisp and clean. I rode up with the team, my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. After 20 years of wondering, I might finally learn the truth about Mother's fate. The Lucky Strike mine looked different in summer, less forbidding somehow. Wildflowers bloomed among the rocks, and the sound of running water echoed from hidden streams. We started with the mine itself, using the metal detector to search for any artifacts that might have been missed. The equipment was more sensitive than I'd expected, beeping constantly as it detected nails, scraps of metal, and other debris left by the miners. But after 2 hours of careful searching, we'd found nothing that belonged to Mother. Captain Morrison suggested we expand the search in a grid pattern, covering every square yard of the area systematically. The team spread out across the mountainside, moving slowly and methodically. I watched them work, remembering all the times I'd searched these same slopes on my own, looking for some trace of the woman who'd raised me. The first day yielded nothing significant. A few old mining tools, some rusted cans and bottles, but no trace of Mother's remains. As evening approached, I found myself standing at the edge of a deep ravine, staring down into the shadows. The sides were steep and treacherous, covered with loose rock that would shift under a person's weight. If someone had fallen in there, they would never climb out. "That's where we'll search tomorrow," Captain Morrison said, joining me at the edge. "It's dangerous work, but if someone wanted to hide a body, that ravine would be the perfect place. The rockfalls over the years would have covered anything at the bottom. The second day brought better weather but harder work. 2 of Morrison's men rappelled into the ravine, while the rest of us maintained safety lines from above. I could hear them calling to each other as they searched, their voices echoing off the stone walls. The search dog, a German shepherd named Rex, grew agitated as they worked, whining and pacing at the edge of the drop. Around noon, one of the searchers called up excitedly. They'd found something wedged between 2 boulders, about 30 feet down. It was a boot. A woman's boot made of brown leather with small brass buttons. My heart raced as they brought it to the surface. The leather was cracked and faded, but I recognized it immediately. Mother had worn those boots on special occasions, had polished them carefully before her trip to the railway station. The discovery energized the entire team. If the boot was there, other evidence might be nearby. They spent the rest of the day combing through every crevice and crack in the ravine walls. As the sun began to set, they found more items. Fragments of blue wool cloth, a brass button from Mother's coat, and finally, heartbreakingly, a small gold locket that had been her most prized possession. I held the locket in my trembling hands, remembering how she'd worn it every day for as long as I could remember. Inside was a tiny photograph of Father from their wedding day, still visible despite the years of exposure. The chain was broken, probably torn away during whatever struggle had ended her life. But the locket itself was intact, a tangible link to the woman I'd lost so long ago. Captain Morrison examined the evidence carefully. The items were scattered over a wide area, he explained, consistent with a body that had been thrown or fallen from the rim of the ravine. The bones themselves had probably been scattered by animals or washed away by spring runoff over the years. But there was enough evidence to confirm what I'd suspected. This was where Margaret Hawthorne had met her end. The team spent 2 more days searching the ravine and the surrounding area, but they found no other significant evidence. The mountain had claimed most of what remained of Mother, leaving only these few precious artifacts as proof of her final resting place. It wasn't the complete answer I'd hoped for, but it was enough. I finally knew where she died, could finally bring some part of her home. We held a memorial service the following Sunday, the whole community gathering at the little church where Mother had worshipped. I spoke about her life, her kindness, her strength in the face of hardship, but mostly I spoke about how she died trying to protect what was rightfully ours, how she'd faced danger rather than abandon her family's interests. She'd been braver than any of us had known. Sarah placed Mother's few recovered belongings in a wooden box, along with the red scarf that had started this final chapter of the search. We buried the box in the family plot, next to Father's grave, and the empty headstone we'd erected 20 years earlier. The inscription was simple: Margaret Hawthorne, beloved wife and mother, lost but not forgotten. The children, now grown with families of their own, gathered around the grave as the minister spoke the final words. My daughter Margaret, named for her grandmother, laid a bouquet of wildflowers on the fresh earth. She would have loved these mountains, she said softly, even if they took her from us. I stood there in the fading light, thinking about all the years I'd spent searching for answers. The questions that had haunted me since that December day were finally resolved. Mother hadn't abandoned us, hadn't chosen to disappear. She died protecting our family's legacy, victim of a criminal who'd seen her as an obstacle to his plans. The red scarf fluttered in the evening breeze, still bright against the dark earth of the grave. It had been her final gift to us, the clue that had eventually led us to the truth. Without it, we might never have known what happened to Margaret Hawthorne. The mountains had kept their secret for 20 years, but in the end, they'd given her back to us. As we walked away from the cemetery, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The mystery that had consumed half my life was finally solved. Mother could rest in peace now, and so could we. The railway station where she'd disappeared was long gone, replaced by progress and time, but her memory would endure, carried forward by the family she'd died trying to protect. 25 years have passed since we found Mother's scarf in the mountain snow. I'm an old man now, my hair gone white and my hands gnarled from a lifetime of ranch work. The children have children of their own, and the family name continues to spread across these Montana valleys. But I still think about that December day when Margaret Hawthorne stepped onto a train and never came home. The ranch prospers under my grandson's management now. He's got Mother's head for business and Father's steady hand with cattle. The land that she died protecting has provided for 3 generations of our family, and it'll provide for generations to come. Sometimes I think she knows that, wherever she is. The investment she made in the Lucky Strike claim was never about the money. It was about securing our future. The mountains look different to me now, less forbidding somehow. I know their secrets. Understand that they're not malicious, just indifferent. They took Mother from us, but they also preserved the evidence that led us to the truth. In their harsh beauty, there's a kind of justice that doesn't depend on human courts or earthly punishment. Sarah passed 5 years ago, succumbing to the cancer that had been eating at her for months. I buried her next to Mother and Father, completing the family circle in our little cemetery. She'd been patient with my obsession, understanding that some wounds need decades to heal. In her final days, she told me she was glad we'd found the truth about Mother, glad that the mystery had finally been laid to rest. The red scarf hangs in a frame above the fireplace now, displayed alongside Mother's photograph and the few belongings we recovered from the ravine. My granddaughter asks about it sometimes, wants to know the story of the woman who disappeared at the railway station. I tell her the tale in simple words, explaining how love and greed can collide in terrible ways. Wade Garrett was never brought to justice for Mother's murder. Detective Harrison tracked him to Mexico, where he'd lived under an assumed name until his death in 1905. He died wealthy, having invested his stolen silver profits in legitimate businesses. The knowledge of his comfortable end still rankles, but I've learned that justice isn't always swift or satisfying. Sometimes it's enough to know the truth. The Lucky Strike claim was eventually sold to a mining company that extracted millions of dollars worth of silver from the mountain. Mother's investment, made in good faith with Elias Morrison, would have made our family wealthy beyond imagining. But I've never regretted the loss. Some treasures aren't worth the price they demand. I visit the cemetery every Sunday after church, kneeling by the graves to pull weeds and arrange fresh flowers. The headstones are weathered now, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of mountain weather. But I remember every word, every date, every detail of the lives they commemorate. Memory is the only immortality we truly possess. The railway station where Mother disappeared was rebuilt in the modern style, all glass and steel instead of weathered wood. Diesel engines have replaced the steam locomotives that once echoed through these valleys. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind is right, I swear I can still hear that old 4:15 whistle calling across the years. Young people in town don't remember the mystery of Margaret Hawthorne's disappearance. To them, it's ancient history, a story from their grandparents, time. But for those of us who lived through it, the memory remains sharp as winter air. We learned that love and loss are woven together like threads in a tapestry, each giving meaning to the other. I've written down this story for my descendants, hoping they'll understand why their great-grandmother's disappearance shaped our family for generations. She was braver than she needed to be, more determined than was safe. She died trying to secure our future, and in the end, she succeeded. The ranch endures, the family grows, and her memory lives on in every sunset over these Montana mountains. The red scarf has faded over the years, its bright color muted by time and exposure, but it remains whole, unraveled, a testament to the woman who wore it on that final journey. Sometimes I take it from its frame and hold it to the light, remembering the sound of her laughter and the warmth of her embrace. She's been gone longer than she was with us, but her presence still fills this house. At night, when sleep eludes me, I stand at the window and look out at Whitman's Peak. The mountain rises like a monument against the stars, keeping its remaining secrets close. Mother's bones lie somewhere in those rocky heights, part of the landscape she loved and died trying to protect. It's a hard resting place, but perhaps fitting for a woman who never took the easy path. The mystery that consumed 20 years of my life is finally at peace. Margaret Hawthorne's story has been told, her fate revealed, her courage remembered. The railway station where it all began is gone, replaced by progress and time. But her legacy endures in the family she died protecting, in the land she fought to preserve, and in the red scarf that brought her home at last. The wind still blows cold through these mountains, carrying the scent of pine and snow, but it no longer sounds lonely to me. It sounds like memory, like love that transcends death, like the whispered promise that some bonds can never be broken. Margaret Hawthorne disappeared at the railway station 25 years ago, but she never really left us. She lives on in every sunrise over the ranch, in every story told by the fire, in every red thread that binds our family together across the years.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.